Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today we're continuing my series about the evolution of Portuguese as a language. If you missed the first 3 videos in which I talked about Portuguese in general as a language, European Portuguese, and Brazilian Portuguese and its grammar, I would highly suggest you go watch those videos. That being said, today's video is going to be about Brazilian pronunciation. There was so much to talk about in Brazilian Portuguese that I had to split it up into 2 videos. When we talk about Brazilian Portuguese, we have to take into account the context in which Brazilian Portuguese was born. Brazilian Portuguese arose in the earliest part of the modern Portuguese era. What this means is that Portuguese had already undergone certain important phonetic changes by the time it landed on the Brazilian shores. This includes word final O being pronounced as U, such as in first-person conjugations like falo, but it also includes things like the development of unstressed E being pronounced like E, giving us pronunciations like D for the word the. Portuguese at that time had very open vowels, and it wouldn't be until much later that European Portuguese would go on to develop further unstressed reduction of its vowels and close off the vowels so characteristic of European Portuguese today. Conversely, Brazilian Portuguese's characteristic open vowels were inherited from this earlier vowel structure. This explains the difference between the Brazilian pronunciation of certain words like morar with an O sound and the reduced European Portuguese murar with an U sound. Brazilian Portuguese, simply put, never went that far with the vowel reduction in all of those positions. But that being said, when we're talking about the evolution of the pronunciation of Brazilian Portuguese, we have to fast forward from the 15 and 1600s when the colonies were first stabilizing to about the 1800s. It wasn't until the early 1800s that Portuguese became fully widespread in Brazil. Portuguese, by decree and for social reasons as well, came to displace the línguas gerais, which were creoles based on indigenous languages and Portuguese. So Portuguese up until this point was mostly just spoken by Portuguese colonists and the administrative officials that were working in the Brazilian colonies. This created a very small class of native Brazilian-born Portuguese speakers who did preserve these older features that I just mentioned. However, the lower classes would take their time in coming to adopt Portuguese as well. So when we look at the evolution of the pronunciation of Brazilian Portuguese, we're really talking from the mid-1800s to the modern day. Brazilian Portuguese, as a variety of Portuguese, is a language that can be described as in a state of rapid transition. There are many different reasons for this, but what this means is that the many changes in Brazilian Portuguese happen quickly and spread very far. Although many of the things that we're about to talk about are widespread in a general form in Brazil, there are many older speakers especially who do not speak in these ways because they were born and raised in a time before these pronunciations were widespread. So in taking all of that into account, let's get started talking about some of the most distinctive characteristics of Brazilian Portuguese and how they were innovated into the language. There are several patterns of Brazilian pronunciation that make it very distinctive, not just among Portuguese, but among Romance languages as well. Those include things like palatalization, or the ch and j sounds that you hear in Brazilian Portuguese, but it also includes things like vocalization, or the reduction of L to a w sound. There are other things as well, and let's talk about those really briefly. R in Portuguese is a very complicated phoneme. There are many different ways of pronouncing R in Portuguese, and they are all strictly context dependent. Nowhere is this more the case than in Brazil. However, because of the complexities of R in Portuguese, I'm actually going to dedicate an entire other video to R in all varieties of Portuguese, where we talk about why it's so context dependent and how some of the sound shifts came to be. But I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the most Brazilian R of them all, which is the caipira R. If you've ever heard a Brazilian speaker saying you'll know what I'm talking about. This very hard sound is a uniquely Brazilian sound. The caipira R is the most prominent sound in Brazilian Portuguese that is attributed to influence from indigenous languages. There is a wide consensus, but not a complete consensus, as to the indigenous influence on this R, and the way in which indigenous speakers would come to influence the way in which this sound is pronounced is widely disputed. That being said, the Brazilian sound, although it sounds similar to English is slightly different. It's pronounced further back in the mouth, creating a harder This sound is especially prominent in the interior of Brazil. It can be heard especially in the interior of São Paulo and regions of Minas Gerais, but stretches from areas of Goiânia all the way down to Rio Grande do Sul. Speaking of R's in Brazilian Portuguese, there is another phenomenon that is becoming widespread in informal and uneducated Brazilian speech. I'm talking about the dropping of R at the end of words, so at the end of the infinitive form of verbs or words like calor. This leads to those words being pronounced without the R, resulting in words like calor being calô, or falar being falar, or comer being comer. This process is in fact not unique to Brazilian Portuguese among the Romance languages. Indeed, among the Romance languages, it is fairly common, so it can be said that Brazilian Portuguese in its own way is evolving along similar lines to other Romance languages that have dropped word final R as a pronounced sound. Like I said before, I will be talking about R in general across all varieties of Portuguese in an upcoming video, so keep your eyes posted for that. But let's continue along with Brazilian Portuguese and the vocalization of L. What I'm talking about is the way that Brazilian speakers make the L at the end of words sound like a W. You get words like Brasil, or words like mal and mau, and mel and meu being homophones. This pronunciation pattern is so widespread in Brazil as to be fully general. In general, the people who don't vocalize their L's in Brazil are older speakers or people who come from communities where an immigrant language is influencing their Portuguese. The process of getting from ul to u might not seem completely straightforward, so let's break that down a little bit. In Portuguese, both in Europe and Brazil, the pronunciation of word or syllable final ul began to become increasingly velarized. In Portugal, that resulted in the very velar, strong, or dark L sound that we hear in European Portuguese. Falo, mal. But what happened in Brazil is that velarization didn't consolidate itself. Instead, the pronunciation further back in the mouth would result in people not touching their tongues to their mouth. Because when the tongue is touching the mouth to make that ul sound, when the tongue stops touching the mouth, you get an oo sound. So in a gradual manner, people trying to pronounce an ul in the back of the mouth ended up pronouncing a woo sound. That woo sound became widespread in the mid-1900s. But some regions take that even further. The Northeast in particular, in many cases, will even drop that woo sound altogether. And indeed, across Brazil, where that L is preceded by an oo sound, that reduced woo sound is dropped altogether. Some people do maintain a diphthong and say words like sul as su, but that oo diphthong is unnatural in Portuguese, so the elimination of that L in that context altogether is not that far-fetched. But we still have one more thing to talk about, and that is the most characteristic Brazilian sound of them all. I'm talking about ch and j. In Brazil, there is a bit of cultural attachment to the pronunciation or not of ch, and many people will argue vociferously that it is not a widespread sound and not all of Brazil talks like that. However, I'm here to clarify the use of ch and j in Brazilian Portuguese. This sound that results from the pronunciation of t or d in a palatalized way is called palatalization. What that means is that when pronouncing those sounds, the tongue moves onto the palate or that little ridge in the front of the mouth. That results in a ch or j sound as it becomes what is known as an affricate. Because of the Brazilian maintenance of the reduced e sound, the letter e turning into an e sound, that e sound that's higher in the mouth than an or an A naturally favors the tongue moving into a position that would produce that ch sound. But we need to take it a step back and trace the origin of that palatalization in the first place. The first widespread documentation of the palatalization of ch and j in Brazil was in Rio de Janeiro. In about the mid-century of the 20th century, people started to notice that in Rio de Janeiro, people were speaking with this ch and j sound. However, this wouldn't become widespread throughout Brazil until several decades later. Things like television and radio are credited with the dissemination of this sound throughout Brazil, especially in urban Brazil. Indeed, this palatalization is strongest in cities in Brazil. Because Rio has historically been the cultural capital of Brazil, radio and television broadcasts with speakers from there would then go on to influence people who were watching or listening to them in other places, but especially in cities. City dwellers who have tended to have higher access to things like education and economic means for things like televisions and radios would therefore go on to be influenced by this manner of speech. So by the 1980s, studies are already seeing that this pattern of speech is becoming generalized in urban Brazil. But the most interesting thing about this phenomenon is that it's been in the last 20 years that we've seen the greatest growth and the most widespread adoption of this sound throughout Brazil. Nowadays, throughout Brazil, the only only regions in which chi and ji are not the most widespread pronunciation are in a corner of the northeast radiating out from the city of Recife, spreading across all of the smaller northeastern states, and some communities in the south that are more influenced by immigrant language communities. Systematically throughout Brazil, in the last 20 to 30 years, the pronunciation of ch and j has been widely adopted, especially by younger people. The pronunciation of ch and j is shown in studies to be associated with a higher social status. It is, therefore, a pronuncia culta. What that means is that it's associated with people who have greater economic means or greater levels of education. And not coincidentally, therefore, in mixed regions like Rio Grande do Sul itself, it is the city, in this case Porto Alegre, where ch and j is the pronunciation. Only when you leave the city and start getting into the rural areas do you start to have a more mixed bag. Although this kind of urban-rural divide can be said to be the case in many different areas, the overwhelming tendency is that young people are adopting the ch and j pronunciation. The exception to this rule continues to be in the northeastern corner of Brazil. In that region, in a lot of accents, unstressed e has shifted to more of an s sound or some variation thereof. So you get pronunciations like gente instead of gente. As we know already, the pronunciation of an e sound in an unstressed position favors the ch pronunciation, whereas a lower sound does not. This explains in part why those regions of the Northeast have seemingly resisted the ch and j phenomenon. But Brazilian Portuguese pronunciation has also innovated in other ways. A while back I made a video about the song Sua Cara by Anitta and Pablo Vittar, looking at certain linguistic phenomenon. In that specifically I was talking about the insertion of an e sound between consonant clusters in Brazilian Portuguese. This in Portuguese is called epentes, and what I'm referring to is the pronunciation of words like pneu instead of pneu, and advogado instead of advogado. That insertion of an e sound, as you might have guessed, also favors a palatalized pronunciation that leads certain words to be pronounced like advogado. This is a very uniquely Brazilian innovation in Portuguese. In all of the most current studies in Brazilian Portuguese, all signs point to ch and j generalizing much the same way that the vocalized L did all throughout Brazil, except in the northeastern corner of the country. But I dare say that's quite a lot of information to take in for one video. If you'd like me to go into greater detail about any of these topics, I'd be happy to make a video about them. Just let me know in the comments below or on social media. But for now, that's all I've got for Brazilian pronunciation. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you did or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food, culture, and especially the Portuguese language, which you can find on my channel or in playlists in the eye above, and I will see you next time.